got a mic now. Alex Williams.
I'm Alex Williams of the New Stack, and it's so great to be here. And I want to thank Angie McGuire and the whole team here for putting on this event. I'd say we just give another round of applause for them. This is the first container camp that I've attended, and I'm just really happy to be here and talk really about the container orchestration market. We are looking at this market. We're studying the market. We publish a series of ebooks on the Docker and container ecosystem, and this is my little push for those. And a lot of this data that I'm going to be presenting here is going to be in this book on automation and orchestration. I think one of the things that we're finding, at least, is that what we're trying to do with these ebooks is help people better understand these markets. And I think what we see today, at least, is really this forming ecosystem. And I think what you'll see reflected in here is a bit of confusion about what actually these terms mean. But I think that's just a natural kind of state of any developing market. One of the things that we did find actually through the research that we've done is trying to looking at the open source ecosystem and understanding its dynamics. And one of the things that we found is we were able to cite some of the leading people who are contributors to the ecosystem, and those include Brandon Phillips, Jonathan Rudenberg, and Jesse Frizzell, who are all speaking here today. So I think it's representative of that. So, so we did a survey of of people who are using containers. Plus, we talked to vendors. We had 309 respondents. 61% of those were end users, and 49% are end users, are DevOps consider themselves, and and then we have the other end users who are using or trialing containers. And so we were interested in just finding out how are they thinking about container orchestration, and how are they thinking about the terminology as well. I think one of the things that we're seeing is that in this continuing shift of the container ecosystems, it means that there's a lot of contrary views surrounding virtual machines, containers, and the roles that they play in automated scaled-out environments. There are also many unknowns, as most technical professionals have little experience just developing on distributed platforms. I think one of the things that we're really we're seeing is that this is just such a new territory for people. You see companies that are very developer-centric, or you see companies that actually have a culture of systems administration. I think we're just starting to see these emergence of these cultures that are around people who really have these distributed systems experience. And so, running clusters and orchestrating thousands of containers, is an entirely new game. And it really puts software at the center stage. And I think that's really what we're seeing now with the evolution of containers and their rapid adoption, the rapid acceleration of the container ecosystem. With software at the center of any organization, open source is increasingly at the center of software. And so we're seeing this new world that really requires this advanced appreciation of really automation via APIs and orchestration, and it takes into account the need for scheduling, cluster management, and all these other associated issues. So what we see is, like with the orchestration of containers, is really changing the lens of how we view applications. So microservices orient developers to focus on services and how those services differentiate applications. So containers are catalysts really for making these applications behave according to the components on distributed clusters. So thus we see the arrival of Apache Mesos, Docker Swarm, Hashi Nomad, and Kubernetes. These are all good examples of this. They really help these communities understand how to model clusters and make the services accessible. So with that in mind, what's fascinating for us is how we're starting to see these almost entirely ephemeral platforms that companies are building. They're adopting these elastic, scaled out platforms. The concepts for how to eliminate the virtual machine entirely is becoming something that people are talking about. They're building on bare metal, they're creating these container-based clusters. This is a lot of new stuff. And it really what it does, it adds up to a lot of change in how we think about automation and orchestration. But really, there is this one principle that does remain, and that's this push towards this programmable infrastructure. And I think that's quite apparent in what we're seeing in the market, and how those methods, in applying methods really to software development into this management of IT infrastructure across thousands of clouds. I think that's kind of the reality that we'll see over time. One of the things I think that, one of the themes that I think you'll see in this data here is still this kind of bifurcation between developers and operations teams. And you're starting to see this need, really, this increasing need for these integrated tool environments. So let's get into the data. So this was first slide that we put together to show really that configuration management is something that is not top of mind, really, with this community, which may not be a surprise to the people in this room, but it really shows, I think, that there's this kind of different view on what configuration management is and how and how it applies. But it's a question of the question I think will become is what role config management will play, and it's pretty apparent from our research that there's some real factors to consider here. I think first of all, I think you're going to start to see companies like Puppet Labs start to invest more deeply into container orchestration environments. We ran a story this week about Puppet Labs and some of the new work that they're doing, and what you're seeing from them is that they're starting to think about how they can release modules for managing Docker daemons and containers, and so they have a new module for Docker. They're building modules for Kubernetes. They're building them out for Mesos. So I think as one person said, if you think about what made Puppet successful so far, is that it abstracts the underlying details of the infrastructure away from what you want to do with it. And so in their view, with Puppet's experience and adoption in the enterprise, coupled with their routes and infrastructure and code and open source, they feel well positioned to try and drive that conversation, hopefully speed up the adoption of these innovative technologies. So it's apparent that that these guys are. I think the game is just beginning, really, in this regard. So here is another slide I think that shows somewhat of the still forming views of what the market really is. And scheduling really is not top of mind when application developers think of container orchestration, right? They think of service discovery, for example. But if you look down here, configuration management is mentioned. It doesn't get such a low ranking, which I think is, we're actually looking more deeply into this because we're trying to understand the dynamics behind that. It may be a kind of a factor of how people actually consider configuration management. Because if you look at monitoring, for example, you look at that, it's at the same level of configuration management, but do people start to associate, are people kind of, thinking of these terms, in similar ways or differently or what? The container, this is one of the areas I think is most interesting, is the container as a service market and what's happening in this space. And again, I think you start to see kind of the different perspectives on what container as a service actually is for people. And so, for example, if you look at you look at what some of the vendors are doing. So I have some notes here about how Docker, they released software for running computers as a service operations in-house with their Docker data center tool. There's also one of our analysts who actually writes for Forbes as well, John Akiram, MSV. He wrote recently that Azure Container Service really is an interface between its own assets and the orchestration layer. And So that's an interesting different take on it. You know, that talks about really, you know, looking at it from almost from that operations perspective. You know, in his view, this allows for the mapping of the block storage of VMs and other assets to the orchestration layer. And then really the goal here is to give the developer the ability to launch a container cluster from the command line as simply as they can launch an HT Insight Hadoop cluster on Linux. Google Container Engine, you know, they're also thinking about, you know, about this in many ways, and that serves as a separation between Google Compute Engine and Kubernetes. You also have Amazon EC2 container service, and then you get into, you know, companies like Joyent. They have Triton, which is a service that treats containers natively and allows containers to run on bare metal while eliminating the VM abstraction layer. Brian Cantrell, in his always wondrous ways, says this. He says it calls. What do you say here? He says Brian calls it an unnecessary layer of fat. So, you know, that's one way to put it. You know, then there's Rackspace, and they've launched Carina, and that's another container as a service, but that's much more of a managed environment. You know, that speaks to, you know, the hosting and managing for the user themselves. To me, it's like if you look at something like Rackspace Carina compared to, like, you know, what Azure is doing, there almost seems like they're like looking at different kind of parties to try to, you know, to provide this for. There's also OpenStack's Nova Scheduler, which recognizes host aggregates or clusters of physical servers, and they're designed to be separated from other availability zones. So there's lots of different options out there that we're starting to see. So we have different IT teams, different perspectives on containers as a service, different from those doing DevOps. Again, you know, this is again, I think, you know, evidence of kind of, you know, this still forming market for, you know, for what these terms mean to people and the roles that people view that they play in this emerging container market. So we looked at how vendors are considering, you know, how vendors define container orchestration and container as a service. You know, one of the things that you know, the employees that do work with in this ecosystem, they're much less likely to check most of the boxes when asked to define functionality associated with either container orchestration or container as a service. So, you know, what we're seeing is that, you know, fewer vendors said cluster management equals to container orchestration, and that registry deployment and cloud orchestration are components of containers as a service. So one reason employees of vendors involved with containers are more discriminating is their definitions that they have likely spent more time attending events. They're knowledgeable about the subject, so they have definitely a different perspective on it. And another reason may just be that again, this is an issue of broader definitions of the market, and it does not really fit into how, you know, they're marketing their own products. So you know, so no matter what the difference is, they point to the fact that beyond industry insiders, there is a continuing need to, you know, to define this market. And you know, and we hear a lot about, you know, DevOps and DevOps culture and how there needs to be cultural change and everything else. But when you really get down to it, it's like, you know, I spent some time with Capital One, and we spent a lot of time talking about, you know, their internal changes that they went through, and it was pretty interesting because, you know, they went from like 8,000 middleware services to 500 REST APIs, and they did that, and they developed their own API lifecycle management platform. They went through 3 years of really hard work to do that, and it took them, you know, basically that was the cultural change that they made, right? You know, they were forcing people to think that they could all kind of develop, you know, APIs in some uniform way, and that's actually been the change that has resulted in them being able to open to third-party developers, which is, I think, really what, you know, really what a lot of these companies are trying to achieve. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to just be more, trying to open up their internal environment so they can just open up those internal APIs and make them public, and that's exactly what Capital One has done. So orchestration, yeah, so this shouldn't be any much of a too surprise. Orchestration is the primary managing method for 45% of those using or trialing containers. So we see Swarm and Kubernetes. Interestingly, we see shell scripts and customizations are still a big part of this. Configuration management tools, there you go. Container as a service, and down the line. So really, I think here again, I think what we're seeing is we've gone through this phase now, right? And we've seen it kind of in the development of our own books and of our own research into the space. So we had containers, and now that they're starting to go into production, there's whole new demands and there's whole new ways of doing it. But everyone's trying different kinds of things. But what we're definitely seeing are the orchestration platforms are really starting to take hold. Again, speaking then to configuration management and the changes that we're seeing there, it does decline as we move into production. And this might just be kind of, the actual, the use of orchestration platforms overall, where you maybe not necessarily have to use that configuration management platform that you had in the past. So I was just going to look at some of my notes here that despite all these other methods of managing containers, the leading choices are still Swarm, Kubernetes, and Mesos, which were cited. Again, they were cited by 45% of respondents, as we saw in the previous slide. So when we look at this and we think about the container as a service, and along with the other orchestration platforms like Swarm and Kubernetes and Mesos that compete to win over the IT operations, we see some interesting things. So you still see the orchestration platforms that we're very, very much kind of the #1 position. So again, here what we see is Kubernetes and interestingly Ansible playing a real vital role in people's user plans for how they're going to be using how they're going to be thinking about container orchestration. So when you think about this, if you look at Ansible, for example, it was a choice of 36% of respondents, which is surprisingly placed it in second, in end users' roadmaps. Among them Ansible respondents, only 10% chose configuration management as their primary method of orchestrating containers. So really what it looks like is that Ansible will be used in conjunction with several other tools, and this may then usher in kind of like the what we see, for instance, with what Puppet Labs is talking about. We're a little bit surprised by this, by this data here. We'd love to get any feedback about it from folks here today. A lot of this is, what we're coming down into these last few slides is we're talking about is market perceptions, right? But it's clear that service discovery is coming down to these three tools in particular: Consul, Zookeeper, and etcd. And if you think about Consul from HashiCorp, Apache Zookeeper, and etcd, and now we have the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, CNCF. These are the tools most cited. But since Mesos utilizes Zookeeper, it does ensure high availability. It's not surprising that 73% of participants solicited, through the Mesosphere promotion that was done in conjunction with this survey, cited Zookeeper. So that's pretty interesting. But you just see how it just totally trails off from the top players. And Kubernetes, Marathon, and Swarm are the commonly used tools for scheduling containers. Again, I don't think that's any too surprise considering the how you're using these orchestration platforms, how these orchestration platforms are being used. So again, I think what we're seeing here is that there's this need for these integrated tool environments for both developers and IT operations that can plug into, a wide range of infrastructure providers. What we were seeing is a usability in many different environments is something that a technology can improve upon as it matures, which is not too surprising. It's hard to address the ability to handle specific use cases. I think one of the things that's interesting for us is like when we talk to a lot of people in this market is like, what are those core use cases? What is an outlier use case and what just is actual core use case? And I think that's still information that we're still trying to understand. So another slide showing the need to support long-running applications and load balancing capabilities are important. Again, an operations perspective. So what are some of the takeaways that we get out of this? Really comes down to the definition of container orchestration. Scheduling, cluster management, and service discovery are widely acknowledged to be part of container orchestration. That much we really know. But however, provisioning and monitoring are also considered to be part of orchestration by over half of respondents. Docker Swarm is recognized as an underlying technology among many of those planning to use it in Docker Cloud and Docker Data Center offerings. While there's still work to be done, many users of Mesos and Kubernetes understand what products use the underlying technology. Container orchestration platforms do remain the most commonly used method of managing containers, which I don't think is any too surprise. But when you start looking at specific offerings, users are most likely to say they use Kubernetes, which in and of itself is not a product. It's still an open source project. So containers as a service and platform as a service. Despite complaints that container as a service is a buzzword, there is agreement that container as a service does encapsulate several parts of the software development lifecycle. Container orchestration and registries are the abilities most associated with the term. Looking at AWS, at 25%, AWS Elastic Container Service is considered the fourth most considered option for managing containers in the next year, which is significant. And Google Container Engine and Docker Cloud and data center offering are also cited often. But still, there's still not enough data to determine how much bundling users want with their orchestration tools, which I think is that's a big question. Is like when we talk to users, they'd say some of them say, yeah, we want everything in Kubernetes, but I think there's some reticence to that in itself. I could go through the different job roles that we're seeing in there and configuration management, but I don't want to take up too much additional time. But I just want to thank everyone for being here. Are there any questions that anyone has? All right, great.